June 6, 1944, at Normandy's dawn, German defenders awoke to a hell beyond belief. Allied bombers and battleships unleashed a torrent of fire on their beach bunkers, flaming wreckage, and the screams of dying men everywhere. By nightfall, thousands of German soldiers lay dead. This is D-Day through their eyes. The story of D-Day is often told through the eyes of the victors. But on the other side of the beaches, German soldiers lived a nightmare history rarely dares to show. Inside bunkers, trenches, they faced the thunder of Allied firepower and the terror of being overrun. What went through their minds as the horizon darkened with thousands of ships? How did they endure the endless storm of bombs and bullets? And what fate awaited those who somehow survived that day of horror? Stick around as we answer these questions. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. In the days before June 6, 1944, the German defenders of the Atlantic Wall lived in a rhythm that mixed monotony with dread. Along the Normandy coast, thousands of men manned bunkers, trenches, and gun positions, waiting for an invasion they knew would come, though no one knew when or where. They were not the idealized image of the Wehrmacht that Nazi propaganda trumpeted. Years of brutal fighting had hollowed out the German army. 3 long years of war had bled the proud Wehrmacht white, one historian later wrote. Many stationed in Normandy bore scars from the Eastern Front, men who had fought in places like Stalingrad and Kursk. Others were older soldiers, patched together from previous wounds and deemed fit only for static divisions. Mixed among them were conscripts from occupied lands, Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, pressed unwillingly into German service. Their loyalty was shaky, their morale often brittle. Life inside the bunkers followed a numbing routine. Soldiers cleaned rifles with ritual care, checked ammunition, and paced the beaches littered with mines, barbed wire, steel hedgehogs, and wooden stakes meant to gut landing craft. Letters from home arrived occasionally, reminding men of lives that seemed impossibly distant. In the evenings, they smoked, played cards, or told jokes, though laughter always carried an edge of unease. Rumors spread endlessly. The invasion could come at Calais, perhaps Norway, or maybe not at all this year. Some convinced themselves the Allies might never dare. Others felt it was only a matter of time. The Atlantic Wall itself was both comfort and illusion. Hitler's propaganda declared it impregnable. 17 million cubic yards of concrete and 1.3 million tons of steel, sealing Europe against attack. Posters promised that if the Allies crossed the Channel, they would be smashed against this iron barrier. Yet many officers knew the truth. Much of the wall was unfinished, undermanned, or poorly constructed. Some bunkers were fortresses of steel and concrete. Others were little more than flimsy pillboxes. Still, to the men who sat behind its thick walls, the defenses felt like a shield, something solid to hold on to in the face of the unknown. Even at the highest levels, unpreparedness reigned. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening the coastal defenses, had worked frantically to fortify Normandy. But on June 6th, he was not even present. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Adolf Hitler himself, the supreme commander, was famously asleep when the invasion began. Hours passed before he was awakened, leaving frontline units to face the storm with no orders and no reinforcements. On the night of June 5th, German sentries stood watch beneath a heavy, restless wind. Waves crashed against the obstacles planted in the surf. Gulls wheeled in the darkness, and the smell of salt and seaweed carried inland. Some soldiers joked that the Allies would never sail in such weather. Others scanned the horizon nervously, their fingers tightening around cold rifle stocks. In a few bunkers, men tried to sleep, though dreams of invasion fleets and endless waves of enemy troops gave them no rest. By dawn, a fragile stillness blanketed the beaches. Mines and barbed wire glistened with dew. Men moved through the motions of another ordinary morning, brewing coffee, checking weapons, tightening straps. Nothing looked unusual, yet the silence itself seemed unnatural, as though the world were holding its breath. It was the last quiet they would ever know. Within hours, the sky and sea would explode in fire. The storm was coming. Chapter 2. The First Waves. The fragile silence of dawn shattered just after 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944. For the German soldiers manning their posts along the Normandy coast, the calm they had grown used to dissolved in an instant. Out on the horizon, shadows began to take shape, vast and dark, like a storm rolling in from the sea. But this was no act of nature. It was an armada. More than 5,000 ships, from landing craft to battleships bristling with guns, stretched across the channel. To the weary eyes of the defenders, it looked endless. One recalled it as if the ocean itself had turned to steel. Then came the sound, the thunder of naval guns unleashing a barrage that shook bunkers to their foundations. Concrete dust rained from ceilings as men scrambled to their firing positions, ears ringing from the concussions that split the earth beneath them. The invasion, long rumored, had arrived. Omaha, Juneau, Utah, sword and gold, every beach of the Atlantic wall, now braced for its trial by fire. The Allied bombardment had a simple goal: smash German defenses and break morale before the infantry landed. Yet, for all its fury, it was far from perfect. Many strongpoints survived intact, their gunners crawling out through smoke and rubble, coughing but alive, ready to return fire. Soon the sea swarmed with landing craft. AS and Allied soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles clutched, hearts pounding as ramps clanged down. From the bunkers, Germans watched through rangefinders, calling out ranges and sighting in. Machine gunners leveled their MG-42s. Mortarmen adjusted their tubes. Then the ramps fell and chaos erupted. Waves of Allied soldiers spilled forward, boots sinking into wet sand. Some were cut down instantly, collapsing before they had taken 5 steps. Others crawled desperately for cover, huddling behind obstacles, hedgehogs, or the bodies of fallen comrades. At Omaha Beach in particular, the slaughter was terrible. The MG-42's terrifying bursts, likened by survivors to the sound of tearing cloth, ripped through the surf. From their elevated positions, the defenders seemed to hold every advantage: high ground, concrete fortifications, and clear arcs of fire. Yet still the landings pressed on. More landing craft ground ashore, some blown apart before unloading, others spilling out men who sprinted into carnage. Tanks designed to shield the infantry sank in the rough surf or were destroyed moments after landing, leaving exposed men to claw forward on their own. Slowly, inch by inch, battered survivors began to reach cover, forming fragile footholds against the storm. For the Germans, the sight was surreal. No matter how many attackers fell, more ships approached, more men waded forward. Ammunition disappeared faster than expected. Radios crackled with frantic voices, officers shouting it above the roar of guns. It became clear this was no raid or diversion. It was the full-scale invasion they had dreaded. By mid-morning, smoke and fire cloaked the beaches. Vehicles burned, bunkers lay shattered, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the endless thunder of artillery. German strongpoints fought fiercely, many to the last round, but cracks had begun to show. They were holding for now, but only barely. The storm had broken, and it was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Through Smoke and Fire. When the ramps dropped and Allied soldiers surged forward, the Normandy beaches became killing grounds. The first waves of Americans at Omaha and Utah, the British at Gold and Sword, and the Canadians at Juno waded into a storm of fire unlike anything they had ever faced. The German defenders had been waiting, hidden in concrete bunkers, armed with MG-52s that spat 200 rounds a minute. They unleashed hell. One American officer remembered bitterly, as soon as the men left their craft to wade ashore, they came under intense machine gun fire, falling into the bloody water. Every landing craft seemed less like a vessel than a coffin. Packed tightly inside, soldiers had minutes to steel themselves before the doors opened to death. Many never even stepped off the ramp. German gunners, trained to wait until the attackers were knee-deep, cut down platoons with 3-second bursts. The sea itself turned hostile. Weighted by heavy packs, men sank beneath the waves. Others clawed toward shore, finding cover behind steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, or the bodies of fallen comrades. Survival was measured in inches, bought at the cost of others' lives. Mortars whistled overhead and crashed into the sand, sending geysers of earth and blood skyward. Entire groups disappeared in an instant, leaving behind only twisted rifles, broken helmets, and scraps of uniform. For the Germans, the slaughter seemed endless. They fired until barrels glowed red, until the air inside the bunkers filled with sweat, smoke, and the stench of cordite. A single gun could sweep 450 meters of beach, spraying bullets into clusters of men. Yet, no matter how many fell, more kept coming. One German survivor later admitted the sight was surreal. Waves of soldiers rising from surf and smoke, refusing to stop. By midday, the beaches resembled visions of hell. Landing craft burned where they had been hit. Sand churned red with blood. The shoreline was littered with bodies in grotesque stillness, while survivors pressed their faces into the earth, inching forward under fire. And yet, amidst the carnage, there was progress. Some GIs found weak points in the defenses. Crawling through smoke, they hurled grenades into machine gun nests, silencing bunkers one at a time. Others scaled the bluffs, clawing their way upward with rifles and bayonets. Each small victory opened a path for more men to follow. Slowly, the tide turned. German mortar crews fell silent as Allied fire reached them. Snipers were fixed from their perches. Smoke from burning wrecks obscured sightlines, allowing attackers to push inland. By afternoon, the defenders realized the truth. No amount of concrete or bullets could hold back the relentless flood of men and steel. Neither side would forget what unfolded on those beaches. For the Allies, it became the crucible of liberation, where courage was measured in footsteps under fire. For the Germans, it was bitter proof that even the Atlantic Wall could not stop the invasion. By nightfall, the cost was staggering. Estimates suggest between 4,000 and 9,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured. Allied losses, too, numbered in the thousands. Normandy's sands had become altars of sacrifice, where victory was bought in blood, smoke and fire. Chapter 4. Voices from the Wreckage. By the evening of June 6th, the thunder of battle had faded into an eerie, unsettling quiet. Smoke drifted across the beaches. Fires smoldered in wrecked vehicles, and the tide pulled bodies back into the sea. For survivors, Allied and German alike, the silence was unbearable. It was not peace. It was the aftermath of unimaginable violence. German defenders stumbled from shattered bunkers like men rising from tombs. Their ears rang, their uniforms were burned and torn, and the fortifications they had manned just hours before were reduced to rubble. Machine guns stood silent, barrels warped from ceaseless firing. Mortar pits had become craters. Everywhere lay the dead. Machine gunner Heinrich Severloh, who had poured thousands of rounds into Omaha Beach, later admitted that one moment scarred him more than all others. He remembered firing at an American with a flamethrower and watching him drop as a bullet pierced his helmet. For years, he had fired into masses of men. Yet it was this single image, the fall of one soldier, that returned in his nightmares. That incident, he confessed, made a more lasting impression on me than the sight of soldiers collapsing in numbers. Others recalled equally haunting visions. Comrades, he says, buried alive when trenches collapsed. Men screaming for medics who never came. Soldiers drowning only meters from shore, dragged down by heavy packs. Helmets split, rifles twisted, limbs torn away. The beach was a graveyard of smoke, screams, and broken bodies. In one bunker, only 2 men remained, Severloh and his radio operator, Kurt Wernicke. Both were wounded, and as dusk settled, Wernicke delivered the crushing news. Every other member of their team, including their lieutenant, was dead. Crawling from the ruins, the two realized they were utterly alone. Across Normandy, other Germans huddled in cellars, culverts, or shattered farmhouses. Some wept openly, others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Even veterans of the Eastern Front admitted that nothing, not even Stalingrad, had prepared them for this storm of fire and flesh. By nightfall, the defenders understood the truth. The Atlantic Wall was gone, and the Allies had footholds everywhere. Supplies and reinforcements poured ashore by the hour. Cut off and exhausted, the survivors faced the inevitable. Escape was impossible. In one of the bitter ironies of history, Severloh and Wernicke, who hours earlier had commanded American prisoners, now begged those same men to accept their surrender. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Small groups emerged from hiding with hands raised. Others stumbled into Allied lines in shock, weapons discarded. Captivity brought no comfort. The shame of defeat weighed heavily, and the faces of the dead lingered. Years later, veterans admitted the horrors of Normandy never left them. The screaming and flames, one recalled, stayed with us through our dreams, through our waking hours, every day of our lives. For those men, June 6th was more than a battle. It was a wound carved into their souls, a voice from the wreckage that echoed long after the guns had gone silent. Chapter 5. The Long Retreat. For the Germans, June 6th was only the beginning of a nightmare. The beach defenses had crumbled, but what came after was even worse. In the days and weeks that followed, the remnants of once proud divisions staggered back from the coast, fighting not for victory anymore, but for survival. The terrain of Normandy betrayed them at every turn. Thick hedgerows turned every field into a fortress, every narrow lane into a killing ground. The Allies pressed forward relentlessly, their numbers swelling by the hour. as more men, tanks, and supplies poured ashore. For German soldiers retreating through that countryside, the war became a grinding blur of ambushes, firefights, and desperate rearguard actions. There was no safety, even in retreat. Allied fighter bombers prowled the skies, swooping down with rockets and machine guns to strafe columns of trucks, horse-drawn carts, and marching men. Survivors later described the terror of hearing the engines overhead, the shriek of aircraft followed by explosions that tore apart entire convoys. Food and ammunition grew scarce, and soldiers often found themselves scavenging from abandoned farms or sharing scraps with weary horses. Retreat was not orderly, it was chaos. The human toll was staggering. By the end of the Normandy campaign, some 320,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, many of them taken prisoner. Divisions that had landed in France at full strength were reduced to shadows. Some regiments that had once counted thousands of men could muster only a few dozen survivors. Entire units simply ceased to exist, ground into nothing by the relentless Allied advance. The worst came in August, at the Falaise Pocket, where tens of thousands of German troops were surrounded. For days, Allied artillery and aircraft hammered the trapped soldiers. Survivors recalled the valley as a cauldron of death, where corpses of men, horses, and wrecked vehicles lay in grotesque heaps. The smell of death was overwhelming, the earth itself blackened with blood and oil. Few who entered the Falaise Pocket escaped. Those who did carried the memory with them forever. For the survivors pulling back beyond the Seine, each mile was marked by loss. Men collapsed on the roadside, too exhausted to continue. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded who begged for water or morphine. And still the Allies came, pushing the Wehrmacht ever backward. The word victory was no longer even spoken. It was a bitter joke, a cruel illusion. The only goal now was to survive the next day, the next march, the next battle. Emotionally, the toll was immense. German veterans remembered the retreat not only for its physical hardships, but for the crushing weight of grief. Units that had once been tight-knit families were reduced to fragments. Survivors were haunted by guilt. Why had they lived while their comrades had fallen? Others felt only numbness, a hollow shell where pride and hope had once been. Historians later observed that Normandy wasn't just a defeat, it was the destruction of the German army in the West. That 10-week campaign, one wrote, burnt away the very core of the Wehrmacht. By August, the remnants of Hitler's once vaunted Atlantic Wall defenders limped back past the Seine, leaving behind a shattered landscape of ruin. Normandy had consumed them utterly. By the end of Normandy, hundreds of thousands were gone. Sons, fathers, brothers lost forever. These aren't just numbers, but stories of fear and endurance. What stands out most to you? Share in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold voices from history.